Eric.
Mr. Esaf.
What is going on, my man? How you doing today?
I'm well. For those who are paying attention, if they look up at the top left corner, we've already been talking for over an hour. So it's been a great day.
Yeah, it's we totally did not start filming this and have to restart it again because we just got way too off topic, you know?
Actually, we didn't. For the people who don't know, we're not going to hide the fact that this is not just two business partners
Yeah.
in a business that loses money, failing on their first try. No, we just talked. We had a good catch up, and it was nice.
Eric, it was wonderful. I will not admit that we are in actuality good friends. I will strictly view us under a capitalist lens that we're business
Okay.
partners. That it was a
We're in a,
mercantile
we're in a
exchange.
mutually beneficial, profitable exchange
Yes.
as it currently stands.
As
We're
it-
not currently
not-
enemies in commerce.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
not at present moment are we commercially successful, but we're looking at the long term vision. Okay, that's
That's
what I
right.
want to say.
Both
And
investing in each other.
yes, yes. And I want to say, speaking about investing in each other, investing in others, uplifting the world, making the world a better place to live. What? I want to play Helms Bingo. One of my favorite things to do, and that would be there's certain phrases. So Eric, is this coming out on Monday? Is it so it's part of Mass? Like when we're about to talk about something in this episode, it comes out Monday for us, which would be what? This is would it be the 31st? Monday, I think.
It'll be very close. Yeah. So Monday is the first, and
Damn.
so it'll be coming out concurrently with the mass issue.
Damn. Ah, man. Okay, so I was wrong by a day because I was gonna say, folks, you're listening to this right now, 24 hour. Okay, so it's concurrently, same time. Good enough. Good enough. But in that article, the Helms Bingo is one of my favorite things to play, and that is there's different things, either sayings of Eric or various things that you could do in order to win Helms Bingo. And Helms Bingo would be a picture of him shirtless that he doesn't send you, but you find yourself. And one of them would be
There's plenty.
So one of the ones would be principle charity. If he says that, boom, put a little slot down. And he does this. No, Eric, I actually think this is one of your finest articles. Because I think it's of a necessary dimension that isn't spoken about inside of our space. We are going to get to it. Like, I know I'm doing the tease, bro, but I do want to read some critique. So I'm boosting you, but I'm bringing us back down to reality, because we'll get to the topic. I'm sure they saw the title and they get skipped to the timestamp. But someone wrote, they gave us 5 stars, but I do want to address one thing just about this whole time dilation controversy that really seems inescapable. Guy's name is X Chem Kid. Love it. Hypocrites, 5 stars. And the person said, coming from the two that mock the macro factor guy seems a little ironic. At least when I listen to the Macro Factor Are Us podcast, I know what I'm getting. However, when I open up Apple Podcasts for the first Monday during the morning commute, silence. Monday evening, still silence. Time and time again, we hear every single Monday. Not sure what to think when the talking salesman is more honest than the two cult leaders.
That is. Let me just say, without even trying to maintain, the sanctity of kayfabe from Iron Culture, that's a great review.
It is.
I love it.
It is. It is.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
And I will not, because this one I do want to get right into it. I know we're already a few minutes, but I'll say there were some great comments. I really appreciate everyone participating either in the YouTube comment section or leaving iTunes reviews, because it is one of the ways that we manage to interact with the cult. And someone, of course, Eric, I'm not even making this up. I'm not going to delay us any further from the actual topic, but there were some very good comments about you, how hunky you are, your soliloquies, either the banter or everything else. I think we're just really connecting with the audience, and this is like our what do they call it? The proverbial chicken noodle soup for the soul. What was that best-selling series from like 1997 to like 98?
That's
was
it.
it, Eric? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in 99, it was all
I'm
about
not
the
sure
secret.
it's chicken noodle soup.
What
But
is
it's
it?
definitely. I think it's just chicken soup.
Oh,
for
is
the
it
soul.
chicken?
It's chicken noodle? No, it might be chicken noodle soup.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it's we're really close to the title that people will know what we're talking about if they're aware.
Yeah, so chicken noodle soup, stuck on you, stuck together. Oh, by the way, the other Helms Bingo, before I give it over to you, would definitely be the River City Royal Rumble Classic of 2019. The 2011 bodybuilding, contest that Eric participated in that I totally was there. Helm's Deep would be another just chip. Ostensibly was there for like our first 80 episodes, but then as soon as I mentioned it, my man's like, it's out of my vocabulary. But anyways, this Helm's Bingo, if you want to play, this one, because it is the nuts and bolts. It's the deep, let's say, meaning underneath why we lift and why we participate in this community. And what I love, Eric, is I can't think of many other people in this space that could write an article like this, have those discussions, manage to bring, as you always do, the receipts, but make it relevant to both our audience, the audience of mass, but also the community as a whole. So I found myself nodding when I got early access now to this, to so many of the points. And not that my faith was wavering, dear friend, at anything that we do, but just when you got into a little bit of the research or a few of the different things, why those that choose to participate, there's a lot of good to look forward to. And there's a certain way of approaching communication with other people, with lay people. And I just think this is such a necessary topic. So I'm very happy that you wrote it and we're talking about it in today's episode.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate that. And Helm's Bingo is a funny concept that I did not know you were going to bring up. I like it.
Yep.
Yeah. So for those who are wondering what the hell is Omar talking about, so mass is dropping, or has dropped, like right now. And yeah, so as those of you who are not aware, mass monthly applications in strength sport, we do reviews of recently published research in the sectors of strength and physique sport. And the one that I chose, because I do one article per month, was a paper that was actually, it wasn't a systematic review, it wasn't a meta-analysis, it wasn't a randomized controlled trial like we typically cover. It was a call to action / like opinion paper. So it was more of an editorial. Yep. And we don't often review those because it's kind of like reviewing a review. Like, here's my opinion on this person's opinion. But in this case, I made an exception because I did think it was prescient, it was important, and I think it gave me the opportunity to hopefully help people better understand how to interact with something that is like really common these days, of just engaging with incorrect information and the people who promote it or provide it or platform it. And that's a really common thing. Like, myth busting has been around for as long as the evidence-based community's been around. I'd say it's probably kind of their step into the scene. But doing that in an effective way that actually changes minds and educates people, rather than helping to create a subculture, like just kind of, if you will, like rallying the troops together. Those are two different things. And anyway, so the title of this paper it's by Tiller and colleagues, and it's Baseless Claims in Pseudoscience and Health and Wellness, a Call to Action for the Sports, Exercise, and Nutrition Science Community. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a paper, and I believe it is actually open access for those who are interested. And it'd be actually pretty good to get this one in the notes, Omar.
Yep.
Cool. Because my article this month is not the cover story, because it's like an opinion paper about an opinion paper. So mass subscribers won't have access to it, but only mass subscribers will have access to it. It won't be publicly available on Stronger by Science, but you can listen to us talk about it for over an hour today. And you can also read the paper itself. So anyway, it's a really interesting paper, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It is basically a call to, whether you're a professional or an academic, to actively go out and challenge misinformation, disinformation, pseudoscience. And basically the paper explains why pseudoscience and misinformation and disinformation are problems, the negative effects they have, and then it goes into saying, and you should proactively call it out and do something about it. And Omar, I could frame this as a critique of the paper, but I would say that's probably not a fair critique, because I don't think it was their intention. But I will say that the thing that this paper did not go into, which I spent most of my time in the mass article on, was how to do that. Because I think it is just as important as the process of challenging it to do it in a way that is likely to be successful. And I have had many colleagues over the years who have perceived me as the guy who won't do this, who won't call out misinformation or disinformation who won't do myth busting. And I will admit that my personality in some ways is maybe not conducive to being super comfortable with that, because it often does result in conflict, and I'm just not about that. But at the same time, I also have seen the people who are really comfortable with conflict being very ineffective at this. And it has made me question the utility of doing it. And over time, I have thought very hard about how to do it, because I have done it. And I definitely, people, if they've been following my career long enough, they're aware of how I used to do it and how I do it now. And while it's not like the main thing I do, when I do it, it is something that I spend a lot of thought on before I do it. And I think that's actually really important. So anyway, that's kind of a bit of a preamble. But yeah, there's a lot to talk about here on this subject, man.
Eric, I'm super excited to get into this. Just 3 quick points. The first, in my personal Helms bingo, one of your most powerful, I love, you said this off the cuff in one episode, but relevant in what you just said, identifying a problem is not the same as providing a solution to it, where I don't think it's, as you said, it's not a critique on your part, but it's more the biggest step. How does one approach this? And as someone who's participated in our field for such a long period of time, that is the biggest piece of the puzzle. I do love also our direction, point number 2, I was going to say, that we're going, where you wrote an opinion piece on an opinion piece, and now we're reacting to your opinion piece in a video. So it's the natural direction of how we wanted the content to go the whole
Folks,
time.
every time you think that we've hit a rock bottom, like our last episode, it was a Q&A, and we opened it up in the introduction. We have 3 questions. We got to 2 of them, right? So essentially we had 2 questions in our intro banter. And I started with joking that half of our podcast was going to be us repurposing Instagram content, taking short form content and making it long form, which is, ass backwards and just displays our inability to creatively produce content. And instead now it actually became 2/3. We just basically stole Sam's post. Shout out to the boy, talked about it. And then we just gave some throwaway comments about carbohydrates after spending 20 minutes bantering about Instagram. So now you thought, they've got to be at the bottom of this valley, this crag, impaled on rocks, bleeding out. But no, there was a slight fissure, a crack, and now we're falling all the way to hell, folks. And it's our pleasure to have you on board as we continually plummet to new depths of depravity.
Eric, love it. So I'll give one analogy, one comment, and then let's dive all the way in. We're like Prometheus, where we're getting our liver and basically our organs pecked out for eternity, and everyone's watching in front. They think like, how much further down can they go? But we've given the fire of civilization, so it's fine. They will look back. History will absolve us. They will look back in time and realize the genius of what we were doing. It was ahead of the curve, because as content continues to descend down, the cesspool that is like the next iteration, we were at the forefront, for better, for worse. And with that being said, there was one notable thing that you said, and I know, man, we're gonna lose many followers. Eric, I'm just going to call it out, this kind of Marxist ideology that I read here, where you bring up something about behavior change and you call it the trans-theoretical model of behavior change, stages of change. And that sounds wishy-washy to me. So you're going to be talking about things, you're going to take an evidence-based approach, you cite your papers. I didn't have an opportunity to look them up, because you knew that I wouldn't and none of the audience would. But I can only assume that it's flimsy. I can only, just like Greg said, where he's like, what, 2% of people he checks the links, only 2% check the references. I can only assume it's related to social science, and we know that's super flimsy. So whatever that research is that you're purporting as evidence, okay. All I'll say is okay.
Well, as we know, a field that is built on the idea of leveraging people's ability to change and helping them do that, we absolutely shouldn't read any research on behavior change, because it's loosely affiliated with the idea of feelings, which is loosely affiliated with the idea of, I don't know,
being human.
being a wussy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. So no,
Not being
that's fair.
loosely affiliated with not being a productive member of society. Yeah, thank you. No,
Right,
that's good.
exactly.
Well, now, Eric, with that being said, I do want you to start this off because like I said, as someone that participates, and I think this is relevant for a lot of people that are listening, is that we have a vested interest in this community. We want to see it do well. We want to see people that are trying to learn and digest this information get the best possible information. We want to see kind of the ecosystem with which we inhabit not be polluted by too much bull. So there's so many things at play, and then there's many different approaches towards trying to correct it, and we've seen with mixed results some of those approaches. So please take it away.
Well, I think we need to get in the Wayback Machine first to talk about this, and start with a little bit of humility on my part, because I think I did cater to my own conflict aversion initially when I started my career, and I took a relatively I don't know, cynical or judgmental view of people who spend a lot of time myth busting, and I basically dismissed it as it's easy, it's reactive content, and you're not actually telling people what to do. You're spending your whole career telling people what not to do. And I think there's a number of reasons why I did that. First, I do think my personality is a bit conflict averse. Like I just can't operate in this space where I'm constantly, countering, especially people. I'm much more comfortable countering claims. We've done that a lot on Iron Culture. And I think that's something we'll talk about in a bit, the difference between countering claims and countering people. But I think another part of it was also that at the time, say 2012, 13, 14, the evidence-based community, I think, was probably a little too mired in call-out culture and myth-busting and wasn't producing enough. Okay, there's 100 programs and you tell me they're all crap. Well, what should I be doing? Progressive overload. That's not helpful, there's all these different diets and things that are going to help me with weight loss. What should I be doing? Calories in, calories out. Okay, that's not a solution, right? Kind of like you big up me. Identifying the problem is not the same thing as creating a solution. So I've always been very interested in giving people tools rather than helping them know all the things they thought were tools are actually, BS. Yeah. And I think what I've come to realize now in modern times is that there is so much information out there that, of course, misinformation and disinformation is a problem. Like, it's great that, as you say, if we're going to play Omar, if we're going to play Omar bingo, if we talk about the knowledge asymmetry,
yeah.
That has been to some degree, at least there's the possibility of correcting it with the internet and social media. That also comes with it. The unfortunate other side of that double-edged sword is that there is a ton of incorrect information. We see this in politics. We see this in pretty much any sphere where there are ideas. There is misinformation and disinformation, and only disinformation in the case where there's a vested interest where someone can benefit from disinformation. But at the very least, there's a ton of misinformation. And if you're not sure what the difference between the two is, don't worry, we'll get to it. But anyway, way back in the day, I was very much on the myth busting stupid, and we need to get away from that. We need to start producing things because I was seeing how the evidence-based community was basically critiqued and seen by people who were louder voices in the fitness community, like, oh, that's just the nothing works crew. And I don't know, Omar, do you think that's an accurate interpretation, or was I really just leaning into my own personality at that time?
No, I actually think it's accurate.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
So anyway, for this later stage in my career, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, I've really come to come full circle on that. And I think it actually is very important to counter some of the misinformation and disinformation. Actually, can you talk a little bit about what happened when you did something that seems so straightforward of having Eric Trexler talk about the carnivore diet and the kind of heat he caught for that, and people understand why this is a hard space to get into.
Eric, yeah, it's man, I wasn't even thinking about that. That is a perfect point. So we had our man, macro factor guy, Eric Trexler, Dr. Eric Trexler, on the History Channel series Ancient Workouts. And he was on to talk about the carnivore diet. He presented a very level-headed approach where he wasn't smug or condescending or any of those things, just spoke about it within probably 5 minutes, some of the claims, went over them, and then immediately, I would say, kind of like based upon some of Eric's recommendations, I would give Trexler the checks, right, of what he did. But even in that more charitable approach of not just outright denying these claims, like carnivore makes like no sense, getting to the end point, he had the emotional intelligence. I can understand people. I can understand why they think the appeal. And on the plus side, the carnivore diet has a high so right, he was like steel manning the position. Okay. Even still, Eric, because that video went out just to the general public and whatnot, I would say out of the, let's say, 2,000 comments, the ones related to the carnivore diet, pro-carnivore diet enthusiasts, the vitriol that Eric Trexler received was probably the highest he's ever, I think, professionally received for anything he's contributed, which I personally, sadly enough, I wasn't surprised by it. I was disappointed.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was a unique experience for Trexler, because Trexler definitely operates in that position of being someone who's trying to cross that bridge. So it must have been a little sobering for him, but it was unfortunate. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad you framed it the way you did, because that's exactly how I would frame it. Having, of course, seen I know how Trexler speaks, and I think he is extremely charitable. He does steelman. He is he's really doing things, quote unquote, right, or in the most right way you can do to try to. I mean, I think it's evidence that no matter how you do it, when you counter some information, you're going to catch a lot of heat from some very probably a minority of people, but a very vocal minority, the true believers. And I do think it takes a bit of an iron stomach to deal with that. And it is unfortunate that, after we get into all the things that I recommend and the ways, quote unquote, to do it, that even if you do all of that, this is a dicey game to get into, and it can be very uncomfortable, and you're going to catch flack. There's really no way around that, and that's unfortunate. And I think I knew that, and for a large part of my career, I just didn't want any of that smoke. And then I would disguise that in the veil of being above it all, and like, I'm just going to go out here and put out good information instead of, countering misinformation. So this is actually still in my book, and I'm probably going to change it for the 3rd edition. I have a little paragraph where I say what the muscle strength pyramids are not. And here we go. Lastly, I also want to let you know what this guide is not. In this book, I take the position of focusing primarily on what to do, not what not to do. While there's a time and a place to identify incorrect information and to discourage harmful practices, I think as professionals, a greater proportion of our time should be spent on producing useful, actionable content than myth bustings. So while I do turn many misconceptions on their head in this text, it's always in service of providing you with helpful information. Sound good? And I think I mostly still agree with myself, but I'm not sure on the proportions. And I think because at the rate and the frequency at which people are exposed to misinformation and disinformation, I think, let's just put it this way. I read this article by Tiller, this call to action, and my response was not, sweet, yep, I'm good, I do that, I'm part of the solution. My first thought was, should I be doing more? Yeah. And I'm not sure the answer to that, and I'm not going to sit here and say 40% of your content should be blank and 60% should be blank, but I will say that I think I agree with this call to action. But I think before we all start, grabbing our pitchforks and lighting our torches, and clamoring against the bros more like we did in 2012 on Facebook, I think it's incredibly important that we do so in a way that actually is going to impact people and make them think, because a lot of what we do just simply doesn't. So the first thing I want to talk about is a really interesting paper that was done by Dyer and Hall in 2018, and it's the effect of critical thinking education on epistemically unwarranted beliefs in college students. So what they did, it's a pretty cool study, and they did surveys on 806 college students, and what they did is they assessed them at the beginning and the end of a semester, okay? And they basically assessed how many of these students had what they call epistemically unwarranted beliefs. So basically, misinformation or pseudoscience that is based upon things that are untenable if you actually fully understood your education as a college student. Like if you understood, the principles of biology, if you understood the principles of physics, you wouldn't hold these beliefs. It included things like conspiracy theories, but it also just included, some pop culture beliefs and things that weren't accurate, right? Then they had three instructors teach a critical thinking course in the semester, and the individuals who were exposed to that were compared to those who simply took the regular course material and who were engaged in methods courses. So for those who don't know, in not all programs, but some, the last year of, say, your undergraduate degree, and then certainly in your master's or your PhD, you get methods courses, which teach you how to interpret and read research and also how to produce it. And the general line that you'll hear from educators is that these methods classes help people understand how to do critical thinking, and they are much more likely to, and therefore, master students, PhD students are much more likely or less likely to hold, beliefs that are pseudoscience, right? And I think we can all think of enough examples of people with PhDs and MDs who in our space are peddling absolute nonsense that we know that might be true, but it's not true enough, yeah. Right? And this paper actually confirms that. So the difference between a methods paper and a critical thinking paper is that a methods paper teaches you primarily about how research is done and how to conduct it and how to make an experiment logically consistent. But it doesn't teach you how to think in a logically consistent way generally and how to assess claims that way. And people are going to be just as much a victim as appeals to authority, slippery slopes, and all of the various cognitive biases and traps that all humans naturally fall into just in our way of trying to assess information quickly. Right. But critical thinking courses specifically teach you to slow down, assess claims, and look for signs that your cognitive biases are being exploited intentionally or unintentionally. And indeed, that's exactly what they found, is that in the college students who actually had this critical thinking course, more of their epistemically unwarranted beliefs, if you will, were diminished compared to those who just got general science education and got methods papers. And so I think this actually connects really well with your typical hashtag science person, is that they make a lot of posts about science knowledge, and they post a lot about this is wrong, this is right. So you learn facts, but there's not many posts about how to think or how to really assess this type of thing. And that is like, it's not that we people shouldn't learn the facts about carbohydrates. Like that is necessary. It's not either or. That we need this to be a part of our curriculum. And since it is not, it needs to be something that science communicators do as part of what they do if they hope to have an audience that not only learns accurate information, but also becomes over time more resilient to disinformation and misinformation. So I think the typical person who is a science communicator or evidence-based professional or someone who is promoting information is someone who learns a whole lot of science, maybe even participates in science either as a producer, maybe they are a researcher, or as a professional. They use it in their practice, and then they try to promote science, and that's great. But I think what they almost never do is actually learn about the process of science communication and how to effectively do it. So one little bit of humility I will say here is that I do have a PhD in strength conditioning. I have a master's in nutrition and exercise science and a bachelor's in fitness and wellness. I do not have I took a communication course, Omar. I took that as an undergrad in 2007, I believe. So I learned about logic and all that stuff, and I have taken methods courses, but I myself have not had a formal education on this. However, I have tried to educate myself on this stuff, but I am certainly not an expert. So if you are a social psychologist, sociologist, or someone who is literally, now that they actually do exist, taken courses on science communication specifically or critical thinking, you're probably going to spot some holes in what I'm saying, or maybe disagree with certain things, or think I could have done it better. And that's to be expected. I think I'm just a slightly more evolved, if you will, and maybe even being a little arrogant there, typical science communicator. I'm someone who thinks a lot about this, and I've had the time to do it, and I've upskilled myself. And I also don't think it takes much to upskill yourself to consider, how do I communicate with people? And I do think some of it has also come as a consequence of being a coach. Like, just telling people what to do doesn't necessarily change their behavior. You actually have to help them figure out ways to do it. So I think because of my coaching and my time spent and my desire to impact people and make change, this is something I've come in contact with, and I think it's made me an infinitely better science communicator. And hopefully what I can do is get across some of those concepts to people and actually back it up with research. But again, this research is not, ironically, the research I'm going to be talking about is not research I'm familiar with, and my ability to assess its credibility and stuff like that, it is to some degree limited, but I'm overall pretty damn confident in what I'm going to hopefully encourage people to do and the reasons behind it.
Man, only Eric would have those caveats before he lays down the hammer. It's like, look, it's not my field of expertise. Like, I'm like 98% sure the shit's about to hit, but just let me just, proclaim some of these things. Can I say very quickly, Eric, around here, what he's getting at, hunks and hunkettes, is that having your food presented to you, so having just the facts, it's pre-chewed food that's being given to you. And unfortunately, as a result of that, you don't engage in mastication. Not the same as masturbation. And we're very pro mastication here at the Iron Cult, of learning to chew your own damn food. I will say, Eric, man, we kind of jumped to the end there where you said about being a coach, giving you a unique perspective. I want you to go on, but I do wonder for some of those that immediately hop from being a lifter to being a content creator or participant in our space, if one of the necessary, potentially useful things for them would be to be amongst the people, so to speak, and to have some in-person experiential coaching or personal training, some sort of experience where you're actually directly communicating with the people rather than a top-down, like, you're the coach, I'm just making a post and there's no feedback. You don't communicate back to me. I'm just telling you what to do, instead of in the trenches, give them a perspective as to how they should be presenting some of this information. You go on though. That's at the end. We'll get to that in an hour.
No, I do agree. And I think a lot of scientists sit in that boat where they're not necessarily coaches, or just giving out information, and they think, here's facts, here's what's false. Okay, everyone knows what to do now, solve that. And then they look up and like, nothing's really changed, Yeah. So that does happen. And I think that also can happen in people who kind of go directly from degree to content producer without ever having much coaching experience. They can sometimes also have that missing piece. But anyway, I think I don't want to spend too much time on this, Omar, because I don't think there's many people who would go, no, Eric, I disagree. We don't need to be challenging disinformation or misinformation.
Sure.
I think there might have been a few people who were more on the same page at that, maybe in 2010, 11, 12, when I think it was very much like, you can't make a post about anything unless it's perfectly scientific accurate for what we know at the time, without having some person actually you. And don't get me wrong, that still happens. But I think we've done, and I've tried to help this, we've merged a little bit more, like, what are the limitations of science and what do we need to learn in the trenches and how can they work together, instead of it being like bro science versus PubMed. So but just to do my due diligence, I do think it's worth explaining like why it's important to counter this stuff.
Sure. And
I think the strongest argument the authors make is that a lot of the quick fix gimmicks that are promoted in the like the fitness and wellness space, they not only are a distraction or waste people's money, but they actually can derail people from long-term behavior change. And that goes back to what you were talking about, the trans-theoretical model of change. So this is probably the most widely used model to explain how humans change behavior. And, like, there's a classic statistics quote, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. This one does seem to, it relates to the things we'd expect it to. So there was a meta-analysis published in 2018 by Krebs and colleagues, Stages of Change and Psychotherapy Outcomes, a review and meta-analysis, excuse me. And basically what they found is that when they categorize people into different stages of change, the further along they were in the stages of change, which I'll describe in a second, the greater likelihood that the psychotherapy was going to be effective in creating behavior change, right? So the stages of change model, like the traditional 5-step one, is as such. You start at pre-contemplation, which is basically you have no awareness of or a desire for your intention to change behavior. So, for example, this might be, your uncle at the barbecue. He's outside smoking, and he jokes about how, like, I'm not a quitter. He likes smoking, doesn't care, is not worried about the health effects, what have you. The next stage is contemplation, and that's when you're aware of needed behavior change and you're planning for it, but you have not committed to it yet. You're just considering potential ways of dealing with this. This is maybe next year your uncle gets diagnosed with stage 1 cancer, or something like that, or something else maybe less dire, because that might launch you through the different phases, right? After the contemplation phase is the preparation phase. So this is, you're actually committed now, and now you're figuring out, like, what do I do? And I think this is where most science communicators wish everyone was. Like, hey, you just need me to tell you what to do, and that is actually what someone in the preparation stage needs. So it's not that the way people operate in the science communication space is ineffective. It's just probably ineffective for people at certain stages, right? And then from there is the action phase, and that is basically the more active auto-regulatory phase. Like, you want to make sure that what you're doing makes sense based on your continued position. And I think that's what a lot of the more quote unquote like advanced content is for. Like, oh, you've been doing this for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, or whatever, and something has changed. What do you do about it? It's a lot more kind of the mechanics versus the engineering. Like, oh, let's deal with problems as they come up, and it's a little more it's a little less behavior focused, and a little more X's and O's, if you will. You know what I'm saying, Omar? And then finally, there is the maintenance phase, and that is specifically about, okay, this is an established behavior, or in the case of like smoking cessation, you have quit this for a long time, and how do we prevent relapses? What can we do to make sure that this behavior doesn't go away? And an important caveat to understanding all of this is that people don't just move through this linearly; they jump around. Sometimes they will have gotten to maintenance and then go all the way back to pre-contemplation, like, I don't lift anymore. It's not for me, or whatever. And that's only a problem if it's a problem, right? But people are not static. They do move forward and backwards. People relapse, and that's to be expected, and that's built into the model. But anyway, so there's that meta-analysis that does show that the further along you are, the more likely you are to basically have a greater likelihood of success when intervention occurs, because you're only going to change when you're ready to change, right? So anyway, that's kind of the background. And believe it or not, the authors didn't talk about the trans-theoretical model at all, but I thought their arguments were incredibly well supported by it. And that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit. So they make a few arguments as why we need this call to action. And the first one, to quote them, is that baseless claims in pseudoscience in the health and wellness industry undermine initiatives aimed at evoking long-term behavior change. And they basically said that the marketing that's out there that exploits our cognitive biases, and they had research to show that it does, makes you think that it doesn't require a long-term effort to make these changes. Short number of weeks, short number of minutes, large effect, small amount of money. That's basically the marketing pitch for whether it's a supplement or 15-minute ads or Tybo or whatever, right? And I think the way people who promote this stuff tell themselves is, hey, it's doing something is better than nothing, and placebo effect is good, and it's great. Sure, this might not be the best thing, but people just got to get active, and I'm a part of the solution. But what I think people maybe don't realize or won't admit to themselves, or maybe some people do know and they're happy to exploit it for profit, is that if you get someone at the contemplation phase and they're not ready to commit, right? The whole thing is they know they need to make a change, but they're not ready to commit. And supplement marketing tells them, guess what? You don't have to commit. Right? It basically feeds into and circumvents their process of moving forward. It says, hey, you need to change your lifestyle. You're not ready to do it, but you're contemplating it. You're trying to figure out what that might look like. Guess what? You don't need to change your lifestyle. Just take this pill. Or, you know what, before you go to bed, when you brush your teeth, just do 5 minutes of X, Y, and Z, or whatever. Or just, add grapefruit to your breakfast. Whatever the hell it is something that in most cases, not always, some of them are crazy alterations to your life that is unsustainable, and that's the problem. But many of them are quick fixes and gimmicks that don't require commitment and effort. So I think that's a major issue. And I think it's important for people just to be aware of that these are not just, the doctors hate him things. Like, it's funny, we laugh about it, and it, buys into that conspiratorial thing. But really, what are they saying there? Why do doctors hate this? because you're actually saying you don't need medical advice. You don't need you don't need to spend 3 hours per week working out. You don't need to overhaul your diet. You just need to do this one trick, and that's subverting the establishment. That's why they don't want it. No, we hate it because it's taking you away from the thing that's actually going to change your life, right?
Eric.
So
real quick, let's say that again. How ahead of the curve was doctors hate him from a market? All that person needed was for COVID to hit, and then that whole marketing line. It's like, yeah, I mean, I'm anti-vax. Like, what are you? They want me to put something in my body. It's like doctors hate him. Well, then he's a friend of mine. He's just 10 years too early. Sorry, just wanted to interject that. Yeah.
You're an enemy of the medical
establishment,
big government establishment. Exactly, the globalist medical conspiracy to suppress.
I'll buy your red drink, bro. Yeah, hell yeah,
absolutely. Give me your pill. I'll take it.
Yeah, your pill on the other end. Yeah, I'll buy
it. Yeah. Put this unproven vaccine in my body. No, but take your pill. Absolutely. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's an interesting. Like I don't think anyone's under any illusions that marketing is not effective because it prevents you from doing logical thinking, right? Like the whole goal is to get you to react and to think in the moment and to leverage things like scarcity so that you don't think logically, so that you overvalue something, right? So anyway, that's just the name of the game with marketing. Doesn't always necessarily mean it's used for evil, right? You can use those same marketing tactics to sell things of high value, and just to increase the engagement with it. But being aware of that, and then being aware of these things is important. And knowing as a health and fitness professional that these are not just innocuous things that are going to lighten your wallet. That for people at certain stages of behavior change, it will actually subvert them from making long-term behavior changes. I think it's a convincing argument as to why this is important. Now, a less convincing argument they made was that this is also true for sports performance. And I think athletes in the general population are a little different. The general population often falls into the supplements or gimmicks instead of behavior change, while athletes often fall into the supplements in addition to, because they're trying to turn over every stone to improve performance. And a lot of the stones have nothing underneath them. So it is just arguably a taking away, money from their pockets or just wasting their time a little bit. But, if they don't get an effect from it, they're happy to move along. But one thing I do think is good to point out is just how powerful the placebo effect is. And for certain types of gimmicks and quick fixes, this can be a problem for athletes. So they used a great example in this paper of the athlete who uses some less than proven alternative medicines. And I don't want to paint all alternative medicines with a broad stroke. Some actually do have evidence basis behind them and can be used in limited capacities. But some of them will have a placebo effect or will have a short-term analgesic effect. And then if the practitioner themselves has a non-evidence-based narrative that this is, curing something, I do think athletes will sometimes continue to get, say, like maintenance chiropractic or acupuncture or cupping or whatever. And it's not that is necessarily doing harm, but it's that because it has an analgesic effect, because it has a placebo effect, then they won't actually treat the underlying symptom, and then something down the line will get worse or crop up. So I have seen that happen with athletes. And the issue there is more so the narrative. Like I think if they had a responsible practitioner who's like, no, if this makes you feel better, great. But there's something going on here. Like you should probably speak to your doctor about this hip pain or whatever, So don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-alternative medicine. But I do think that there is a lot of pervasive narratives in that space that can make athletes think maybe it's all they need, or even sometimes anti-traditional quote unquote medicine, which is or Western, which I think is not an accurate terminology for all medicine. Like a lot of it did actually come from the Middle East, anatomists and things like that. So it's not all Western medicine. It's not traditional versus Western medicine. I don't think that's a useful paradigm. I think that shoehorns both. But there are instances where athletes do shoehorn themselves into not actually treating an underlying cause and just deal with the symptom. And I think that's probably the only space where I would agree with the authors on that. So anyway, that's some of the rationale, Omar, and I think it's a strong rationale whether you operate with athletes or whether you operate with the general public or somewhere in between, like very serious lifters. that some of this stuff can really cause harm, and especially when we're dealing with the nutrition space, where short-term things can feel better, like going back to the carnivore diet. You can eliminate most foods, and you will feel better if you have certain gastrointestinal responses to FODMAPs or whatever, but you're not actually dealing with the issue. You're now actually removing fiber from your diet and a bunch of minerals and vitamins, and they're not going to get depleted in the short term, but you will feel better. And you're also going to be the placebo effect, and this whole I'm part of a community now, and I have secret knowledge. I'm smarter than everybody else who doesn't know things. And next thing like you could actually have some health consequences down the line in a couple of years. So there are a lot of instances where you can see how misinformation and disinformation can do a lot of harm, especially the way that online spaces work, where people tend to draw lines. And, not that I think people create these really like rock solid bubbles like we used to think, but it is very difficult to get outside of some of these communities that promote a very specific narrative, and it's difficult to get contrary information with the way people operate. And the question is well, okay, given that, how do we as practitioners combat this disinformation and misinformation and pseudoscience in a way that is less likely for someone just to block us, ban us, not listen to us, or write us off immediately? Right. And that is the challenging question. I think that's what we're probably going to spend most of this podcast talking about, Omar. So probably first thing to do is get our definitions across, like misinformation. If you open Instagram, you've probably seen misinformation just within the first 5 minutes of scrolling. And that is the unintentional spread of incorrect information. That's just being wrong. And that happens all the time, right? Disinformation, on the other hand, that is someone who actively knows the information they're giving is incorrect, but is promoting it. And I think when it's framed that way, you're thinking about like Russian interference in our election. You think about political things and where there is a goal of having control, but it does happen in fitness and wellness when you think about it. Sometimes it's a little more implicit and a little more subtle. But for example, getting an IFBB pro to promote a supplement. And they claim that their physique more or less is due to that. That's probably the oldest one in the book. And it's might have been the 20 years of training and 2 grams of gear that you've been on for the last 10 years rather than no explode type of deal. So that's the more kind of it's not straight up like, hey, how do we prevent the democratic process from continuing in the States as a foreign agent? But it is definitely there. And people, they self-rationalize why that's okay. But then there's some more overt ones, like simply using Photoshop to make the results of your product or your system look better, or fake plates, or manipulating before and after photos, with lighting, or even just straight editing, right? That's like filters and shit. It's pretty common. So it absolutely does happen. Or for example, doing things like selling a supplement that you might know is bunk, and just using claims and things like that. That's tough. I don't know, for example, the turkesterone situation, whether some of that is misinformation or disinformation, whether they bought into the hype or not. It's difficult to say. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it is hard to tell the difference between whether something is misinformation or disinformation, because how you approach the two should be very different. And the self-righteous person, and I think the person who gets up every day and goes to war with the bros, their natural predilection, and we've seen many examples of this, some very, very popular, is that if it's disinformation, it's time to go to war. I'm going to call the person out. I have moral clearance to get righteous on this son of a bitch, and they're going to be on my stories. I'm going to be in their comments. It's time to call in the harassment squad and bully this bro, right? And that's not the reason why you want to tell the difference between disinformation and misinformation. The thing you actually want to do is make sure that you're not treating someone who is promoting misinformation as though they're promoting disinformation. And ironically, instead of going to war with the person who's promoting disinformation, I actually think what you need to be doing is not engaging with them at all. Because what have they proven to you? They've proven to you they don't care about the truth. They're actively manipulating it to make money or for personal gain, right? So engaging with them that's not the platform to do it. Right, you're going to go behind enemy lines. You're going to post on someone who can literally delete your comment, block you, and then post about you, and you'll never even see it. And that's going to be like, let's have our showdown. I'll show up. I'm going to bring a knife. You bring a gun, and I'll have my eyes closed. It'll go great for me. Like, that's essentially what you're doing when you go on someone else's platform and you try to fight them. So what I think you should be doing when you've identified something that you're sure is disinformation is using the channels you have available to you to counter those claims. And I think it's very important to counter the claims rather than the person. Now, not that I think there's anything necessarily wrong with calling out the person on your own platform, but it may just distract you because they might decide to go to war with you back. And that takes time. And it's the upside potentially, and I will not lie, is that the controversy, and we talked about this off camera, Omar, of engaging with someone in that manner will drive more engagement with your posts, which will get you more followers, which will create more visibility. So it might help you for self-promotion. But I am not convinced that well, it depends on how that controversy ensues and who looks like the more civil person. But if it is done in the typical way where two people are just, having a boxing match online and so are their followers, it might actually be doing, it might be, I'll say it this way. It might have less of a positive effect on changing the hearts and minds of anyone who's on the fence or is unsure or has actually come into the conversation and considering, I wonder who's right. And we can talk about the research to back that up. So anyway, misinformation, disinformation, two different things and need to be approached differently because of that. Does that all make sense?
Eric, it all makes sense.
Love it. All right. So let's talk about what do we do? We come across some misinformation. We come across some disinformation. How do we even address that? And I think the way we do is we need to understand what types of messages are effective and for whom. So I don't know if you're familiar with the concept, Omar, or if the listeners are, but it's something that was thought to be like in around 2014, 2015, a expected normal effect, but it's actually been come to understand that it might only be an effect in extremists or people who are holding very out there beliefs and who are true believers. And that's the backfire effect. And this has been shown in a number of different studies, one in health that I'm aware of, and then one that looked at political beliefs held around the Iraq War era and among liberals and conservatives. And I think probably the more relevant one for this discussion is the health messaging. And importantly, this was a 2014 study. Okay, so it is on effective messages in vaccine promotion. But I want everyone to remember this was before COVID politicized the concept of vaccines. All right, so this was definitely so to try to erase your mind from the last 3 years and go, okay, how were vaccines perceived in a pre-COVID era? And this was specifically a trial where they did these two waves of surveys. And what they were doing is they were polling parents. So I think they had parents with children. So that means they had to be under 18. And it was nearly 2,000 parents, if I recall correctly, in the United States. And they basically trialed a number of different messages from the public health perspective on vaccines. And the goal was to correct the idea that vaccines were related to autism, right? So they tried a number of different messages and they looked at the overall effect and then the effect on people based upon their beliefs of vaccines before they engaged with the research. So they had a number of different metrics they got from this survey. What level of vaccine hesitancy do you have? Are you anti-vax or are you not? And there's a spectrum of based on the responses. And then what happened after you got these informational packets? How did that change your beliefs? So the good news is overall, beliefs that vaccines were related or linked to autism went down at the group level when you looked at all 1,800 of these people. However, a really interesting thing was found that specifically among the parents who had the lowest level of pro-vaccine beliefs, so they were the anti-vaxxers in this group, the people who had the most vaccine hesitancy, they actually more than doubled down. They got worse. So they actually had a more negative perception of vaccines, and they believed they were actually causing, autism to a greater degree after getting information suggesting that they were not, and showing scientific research as to the fact, which was really concerning. And because the backfire effect had also been shown in some political research. So, for example, there was a subset in a study where they were shown the corrective news articles where there was initially the claim that weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. And then people who held that belief and who were conservatives, when they were given information about, oh, actually that news story, that was corrected. And it was like, no, actually, we did not find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They actually increased their belief that weapons of mass destruction were found.
Yeah.
And I think this kind of goes back to how the critical thinking classes were very important. But one of the most durable beliefs that the critical thinking struggled to change were some of the conspiracy theories. Mm-hmm. And the problem with conspiracy theories is that
not enough people believe them.
Correct.
Go on.
Is that they almost always they use the fact that there is evidence to disprove them as evidence that there is proof. Like basically, like that's what they want you to believe. Like that line.
Yep.
Like why would they be sending me these messages about vaccines if there wasn't an issue that they're trying to cover up? You know, or the liberal media is now trying to tell me that there weren't WMDs. Who got to them? You know, I think that's my take on that. Yeah. And I'm not 100% sure. I'm not a conspiracy theory specialist or a social scientist by any means. But it's interesting that there is the backfire effect, but it's not a common thing. So the first author of that paper on the vaccine hesitancy that displayed the pretty concerning backfire effect wrote a paper in 2020 saying, hey, basically this hasn't replicated a lot. So the backfire effect, the good news, folks, is that it's relatively rare. It is not the typical response of people who hold a belief and they get exposed to something. It may be the response in certain subsets of people who have very extreme beliefs and are quote unquote true believers, if you will, in something. And when they are actually doubting the mechanisms by which we come to truth, right? And I think that does make sense. So the good news is that by just simply going out there and myth busting, you're probably not triggering the backfire effect in the majority of people. Okay. So the good news is I don't want to sound too hyperbolic here. Like, hey, if you just go out there and start slaying the bros, you're making the problem worse. But I think the better question is that the best way to do it, to go out there and actively combat people and challenge people? And the answer is probably not. And there's actually research to demonstrate this as well. So as we all know, the reason why folks like myself and other people who have spent a lot of time researching this stuff can't have a place in science communication is because there's a certain level of unavoidable trust in an authority. Like, I can't necessarily assess the veracity of your claims to the depth that you can, but I know that you've studied this. I know that you use scientific language, you're cautious, and you do the things that to me demonstrate that I believe you're an expert. And I'm going to trust your take on things because you're explaining the logic and you're educating me. You're not just an ideologue, right? And that's the best way to do it. But sometimes, people, they follow an ideologue rather than a science communicator. They can't tell the difference, et cetera. So I think there is an unavoidable degree of trust in people who are experts. And that's not a bad thing. It's just hard to differentiate between experts and those who are not. But the way that we identify someone as an expert is not purely contained to the logic they use. And I think this is really important. So there was a really interesting study that was done, I believe, in 2019. And it's titled Testing the Effects of Incivility During Internet Political Discussions on Perceptions of Rational Argument and Evaluations of a Political Outgroup. So putting that in simple terms, they looked at, they had these participants, they asked them what their political beliefs were, so whether they were more left or right leaning, and then they exposed them to left or right leaning arguments on political message boards. And they were simulated, so they weren't real, but they replicated actual arguments that you might see on political message boards or in comments on a news source or what have you. And what they did is they manipulated two factors in these arguments. They manipulated how logic-based and how well referenced the claims were. So they would have more left-leaning or more right-leaning statements, and whether they used references, statistics, facts, and whether the arguments were internally consistent from a logical perspective. That was one factor they manipulated. And then the other factor they manipulated was incivility. So basically, how much of a jerk were you? Did you, so you could have the same rational argument with the same evidence presented, but then you could also start the sentence with the downfall of the Americas because of these, insert the political outgroup, and then call them names, and then you could see the interactions below it and how much of a jerk they were, name calling, personal attacks, etc. How much of that was involved. And then what they asked of the people who were exposed to this, they wanted them to rate how rational the arguments were, and also to rate how they perceived the political outgroups. Okay, you're a liberal. How did you view this conservative argument? And then in terms of rationality, and then how did you view conservatives? And an interesting thing was that these were not independent factors. Like if we were all computers, the person, when asked about the rationality of an argument, would ignore the fact that they called names and were basically an asshole, right? And they would just, rate the rationality of the argument. Did they use references? Was it internally consistent? But that's not at all what happened. In fact, there was a very large effect of incivility on the rating of the rationality. So the more incivil someone was, the more the effect of them lowering the rationality in their mind of the argument. So that's the big problem here, is that when you go to war with someone and when you name call them out, and you're just basically, dunking on the bros, when you're poning noobs, I think people who already agree with you, they like that. And not always, but in many cases, like you are rallying the troops. You are speaking to their frustration. You're airing out the fact that the eye roll they had just two swipes above. Like, oh, thank God someone is saying that this is stupid. God, you go, influencer, evidence-based warrior. And that's great. But for anyone who doesn't necessarily agree with you, they're going to see you as less rational. They're going to devalue your argument. You could take someone who is actually full of shit but is super civil next to someone who is not so civil and has it all right, and you're just going to look like a jerk, and they're actually going to think you're wrong. They're more willing to cling to the person who just seems like someone who's generally trustworthy, right? So I think that's a really important thing, is that the more you can be civil in these engagements, the more people are going to be able to identify the logic in your arguments. And I think, unfortunately, the algorithms in social media reward the opposite. Mm-hmm. And you might be thinking you're succeeding and changing hearts and minds. Like, yeah, I had 100,000 followers, 3 years ago. Now I've got 300,000. That's great. But the reality is that you just were basically a very effective preacher. Like you were literally just preached to the choir, and you have a big ass church now. Like you're an evidence-based evangelist. You found all the true believers, and they are now in your church. You haven't gotten many people who are outside of the flock to join. I think that's I don't have solid data to back that up, but I think that's actually what's happening.
Eric, let me just say, preach, using that same analogy, because being a participant in the field, people will decry how on social media, there's the potential consequence of having too many negative comments. And that could be true in some respect, where like the magnitude of what someone will say compared to what you post. So you post like maybe something evidence-based in quotations about like how to squat, and someone's like, "You're a fucking loser," is the comment. Like, well, that's not like a one-to-one response, but okay. But I think equally, if not more important in terms of some of these conversations, is how, to your point, you could rally the troops. So you start drinking your own Kool-Aid. Someone who has that self-righteousness where it's like, I'm, on the right path. Anyone that has any critique, that's their problem. But the people that are then joining you are boosting that signal. So people focus too often in the conversation, I think also, and I brought this up, like we've spoken about, like sometimes the trolls, this and that, but equally harmful is kind of the lightning rod effect that social media can have of bringing your troops, so to speak. So if you have 100 million potential participants and you create a certain type of content, to your exact point, Eric, you start off with 100,000 followers. Now you have 300,000 followers in your head. Man, I am growing at a crazy pace. People resonating with what I'm saying, but you don't have that. You don't see the hidden graveyard of people you've turned off, people you've permanently now to the whole concept of the things that you're talking about that are now disengaged. So yeah, you gained plus 200,000 followers, but let's make it up, Eric, because I know this from like the statistics of YouTube and social media, where on YouTube, as an example, let's say lifetime I've had 130 million views or whatever on the YouTube channel. And of that, only 30% are from subscribers, which means 70% are from people that have never subscribed to my channel. of that 70%, it's like there's a certain amount of impressions made on those videos, click-through rates, the amount of people that have watched the content, and then potentially, from what I've said alone, been turned off and like, this ain't for me, or like this whole silo, what he's talking about, would be a considerable amount that you never hear from because they never engage with you. So in your viewpoint, you're crushing it. I am leading the righteous war. We all know there's nothing negative about what the Spanish Inquisition, being an inquisitor. Like, what is wrong with putting some heathens to task? Meanwhile, we don't know that hidden graveyard of people that will never, as to your point, go to that point and change the hearts and minds. Instead, you're just getting like kind of the self-righteous, like, kind of applause by your troops, like, you're killing it, wow, like, I can't believe you beat that person down, wow. A liberal gets destroyed by whatever the YouTube video, 10 million views. I'm like, oh my god, that incessant need for like a victory at any cost, and to see someone get dunked upon, just stop.
Yeah, like, absolutely. Like, honestly, how many people who are left leaning clicked on that video and went, I made some really good points, I'm actually going to reconsider my political beliefs? Like, you laughed at that because it's a joke, because we all know it's bullshit. Like, that's never happening. So yeah, I think it's so easy to do that because social media rewards you. But then you have to ask the question, what is my goal here? If your goal is to get on social media and educate people and get people a little closer to the truth and have them have more accurate beliefs, your goal is not to reach people who already have those beliefs. Right. So this becomes incredibly important. And I think it was actually really good to hear from you, someone who I know does look at the statistics on your YouTube channel, and you can speak to that as somewhat of a degree of like proof to the point I was trying to make, as to the effect and how it interacts with social media. But one thing I can say that is actually empirically validated in that same study I was talking about, of you might have turned them off to the whole silo in general, is that's exactly what they found. In addition to this very large effect, we're talking a Cohen's D that was like double a large effect of simply perceiving arguments as less rational when there's more incivility, is that when they recreated the experiment, because the cool thing about some of these social psychology things, they do like multiple experiments on the same topic in one published paper, when they basically ramped up the level of incivility, so it wasn't just a couple jerks here and there, it was like, oh, this is like really inappropriate swearing and all this stuff, like really going after it, that kind of content, it actually made people view the entire political outgroup as less rational. So, I mean, this makes sense to us too. Like, for example, you come across an absolute raving person on the left or right, and it makes you think the left or right is a bigger problem. And anyone who's engaged with any kind of political discourse, that's typically the big error that they make, is they represent the extreme as the status quo. Like, if you think about any of the political demagogues and talking heads, they try to make you afraid of the most extreme out there version of this political belief, even though the majority of people are sitting, center left or center right, So, and I think that is so when you are in civil and when you go after somebody, you might be dunking on them for team science. But when people, and this is absolutely true in fitness, unfortunately, and nutrition, when people identify with groups, because again, you think, oh, what does politics have to do with nutrition? Or what does politics have to do with exercise science? Well, let's just think about how much of a in-group, out-group situation it can be among strength sports, or with CrossFit, or among vegans or vegetarians, or among a carnivore diet. There's a lot of transfer. We're still humans, So if you are exactly what Eric Trexler dealt with, you might be using the principle of charity. You might be speaking cautiously. You might be pointing out the positive aspects of it before you even get to the negative. And you're going to get just railed by the people who are true believers. Now, imagine if Eric had actually been a complete jerk about it and had been like, these fucking carnivore diet, they're idiots. They're so stupid. Like, how worse would the response have been? And anyone who was maybe on the fence, like, oh, I heard something on Joe Rogan, I considered it, I heard something on Mark Bell, like I'm just generally exposed to fitnessy-esque stuff. Oh man, this guy who's he's on a vegetarian diet and he's blasting all of us, like, all these guys, these evidence-based guys are just idiots, and they're just drinking the Kool-Aid. I'm out. Like, I'm unfollowing all this stuff. So by dunking on bros, you might actually be making all the people who are watching think that team science is actually team pseudoscience, and that they have the real science, So you're potentially not only harming the rationality of your own argument, but the entire cause that you're purporting to try to promote.
personally, Eric, I view everything in a weakness strength paradigm. So either things are it's binary. So it's either
How's the
strong or weak. Right. And let me just say that I take kindness as a form of weakness because it's you having a concession towards someone else. And we kind of just know that might is right, which is why it's okay to be comfortable with your. If you know something's right, I'm not gonna apologize for it. So this, I think this is interesting. Like this is probably folks. I think iron culture has been infiltrated. That's what I was trying to allude to earlier on. By big, what was it? Big calendar, big pharma. What's our umbrella, Eric? What's infiltrated iron culture?
I think big calendar is certainly part of it. Big time and space at this point.
Big time and space.
Big physics.
I do find very quickly. I will say I do wonder in this hyper politicized era if. So I agree with every, and it's not just about agreeing. It's like what's the current available research about turning off people, like the backfire effect and so forth. I do wonder how, though, like even those percentages within a society are formed, meaning that within the bedrock of said society, like some either the values that it has, or like the overall education and process, as you said, like if you have a critical thinking course, like how much it benefits people, and then thus downstream like society and whatnot. I do wonder if they were to test some of these ideas, like in 20, because I do think thanks to I'll say social media and the reward mechanisms, our feedback in terms of what we're seeing, and there's very quick, man, let me give a very quick anecdote, and then I want you to go on because we're getting to like the climax here. There was a doctor. She was speaking about her mother, and they were just talking about COVID, and I am bringing it up because like it's relevant, but just about the disinformation that was out there. So it was blatant, like it was intentional. It wasn't just like, unintentional misinformation what people were spreading. But anyways, her mother was a researcher. So this is a doctor, and her mother but she was retired. She was isolated kind of from life. She was in her, I think, 70s at the time. But anyway, so what did she do, Eric? So this is an educated person. She had contributed to some sort of medical research. So had her doctorate, so forth. And so her daughter saw this happen, and she was sharing the story over time that when COVID happened, she was isolated, so she was siloed. She went online and she was just passing the time. She'd watch the news, and then she'd go on the internet. And we know, like, you could just look this up of how, once again, the algorithm works, what it's going to put out to you, because more sensational, it's not looking for something sensational, it's not looking for something provocative, but it's looking for engagement, and things that are provocative, things that are sensational will get more clicks. So anyways, what slowly gets recommended, the funnel that ends up occurring, and the rabbit hole that she goes down, is that her mother becomes a former researcher, hugely anti-vax and all these other things. And then the mother actually, unfortunately, was someone with some of those comorbidity factors that she unfortunately got COVID. And she was adamant up until the end where she passed away that she did not have COVID, like it wasn't a thing, and that this was all a conspiracy. And it's like super, but the point of me bringing up that very specific example of why I think all of us, like even if you have good intentions and quotations, you have to stay right. You have to like challenge your own beliefs. This is someone that contributed to the space 30 or 40 years prior, that is just in another time and place in their life, that has made them, let's say more accepting or less stringent upon fact checking some of the things, or engaging in critical thinking. And it happened to her, as an example. And it brought the daughter obviously to like literal tears, because her doctor's like her daughter's sort of a virologist, like it's someone contributing to the research.
I think the message there is you are not immune.
Yeah.
And it does not matter if you are nodding your head to this and you're aware of critical thinking, and you're someone who's currently doing your PhD or your master's, or you just consume a ton of evidence-based content, and you think about meta science and you think about how to think, and you're like, yeah, it's a big problem, this disinformation, and you see it as something outside of you. It's a problem to society. You are not immune. And I think it is just really important to realize that critical thinking it has to be an active process. It has to be a continual process, because it is not the default setting. We wouldn't be here today as evolved humans, evolved to what we are. I'm not saying we're evolved in a more descriptive sense, unfortunately, but evolved into what we are today, surviving. If that was the way we operated, because we're built to make knee-jerk assumptions. We're built to stereotype. We're built to some degree to think both fast and slow. But the good news is we are also built to think slow, as Daniel Kahneman would put it. But it is something that you have to slow down and actively do. And it is something that there are forces that are actively trying to prevent you from doing, like marketing. You know, they want you to operate on the idea of scarcity. Like, oh, they're going to run out of PDFs. Like, no, they're not. That's not the way that works, you know. Like,
Eric, a quick aside.
Yeah.
My favorite, and like you just gotta shake your head. There was someone that was selling a program, and no joke, to your point, it was a digital course, but they tried to imply, because they heard about scarcity, they said limited we only have so many of these. I'm like, of what? Of digital download, like bandwidth space? Like, what are you talking about here?
Running out of bytes. There's more bytes.
We're running out of internet.
Yeah, there's only a finite number of PDFs. So like that is 100% something that we all can fall victim to.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great, very tragic example of how that can occur, despite some of those things that are in place. So I think it needs to become a daily practice. It needs to become a new way of thinking and living your life and assessing these things. You have to be willing to do things like asking, how could I be wrong? How could this person be wrong? Even though your immediate knee jerk is, yes, that makes sense. Like that squares the circle for me. I had an inkling, and now you explained it. Beautiful. Thank you. You know, and I know that I do that for people. I help them understand something that they vaguely understood, and they have a better understanding, and they feel better about it. But the next step, and the step that I often do try to do, is, and how could that be wrong? How do we see if I can disconfirm that hypothesis?
Yeah.
Right. So, but that is something that you must continually do, you know, and that's why that's so valuable. If you go back to our empiricism versus rationalism discussion we had, to not just rely on just the rationalists, but also have the empirical data and really have them, you know, sit hand in hand together to help you get always a little bit closer to the truth, and always chipping away at your vulnerability to these cognitive biases. So, yeah. Speaking of, there's a couple of razors. I want to get some blades out. I want to cut some things. Not only handless, but people have probably heard of Occam's razor, yeah. You know, which is a generally true, but not always true, razor, which is it is simply that when you have two explanations that are equally plausible, the more simple one is probably accurate, right? This is the bane to the conspiracy theorist, right? And Occam's razor is a very useful. It's a model of thinking that is not always right. It's wrong, but it's useful. And I think the problem is that a lot of people have a very tough time gauging in areas they're non-experts whether there actually are two equally plausible arguments. What it actually comes down to is I hear two talking heads, both sound very smart, and then I have to go with which one's more simple. But some things are complex, you know, and but we do know that is the way humans orient themselves. They generally do actually trend towards Occam's razor, but again, it's very difficult to assess this. So people do, when they're trying to figure out what is the causal explanation for something, why, like, does this X cause Y? If it is a simple explanation, they're more likely to believe that is the case. And there's a good paper that shows this by Lombroso in 2007, and it's titled Simplicity and Probability in Causal Explanation. And they did, I think, a series of like 3 experiments where they basically showed that when things are equal, and you actually can control that in an experiment, and there's a simpler explanation for something, people will favor the simpler explanation, right? Now, it's an interesting thing, simplicity in the fitness space, because you will see the charlatans use both complexity and simplicity as weapons. So you'll see them use complexity to demonstrate their expertise and to do hand waving, right? So they will speak about mechanisms, they'll speak about pathways, they'll speak about complex biochemistry that is at least right-ish, but it is above the people they're talking to. And when it is countered by a true biochemist, it will sound like a debate between academics when in reality it is not, but it is indiscernible to someone listening. So that type of complexity is often used just to gain credibility, to get the platform, to pass the veneer off that they're an expert. But then you'll often hear them make arguments like that are basically appeals to simplicity, right? If this was true, why not this? Like, this isn't complicated. Just cut out fat, or just cut out carbs, or just whatever, it is the silver bullet that is often so like, yeah, on one hand, you'll have someone who builds themselves up with these complex physiology, and then the solution is always something like just do X, when it's a multifaceted problem. And it is very difficult to tear down a misconception where you have to go through all of this complex explanation to deal with something simple. So it's an uphill battle for the person who is trying to disentangle the misinformation or disinformation and educate people, because of the fact that they had a very simple thing they could say because they had your trust, and you have to go through some complexities to show them why that is not the case. Like, for example, the obesity epidemic. If someone tells you it's just due to X, and you're like, fuck, it's the whole damn alphabet, you've got to explain 27 things, right? While they just had to explain one. Is there 27 letters in the alphabet or 26 somewhere?
We added an extra one, yeah.
I thought, yeah, sorry, 26. I just de-experted myself right there. My man literally skipped that day in kindergarten.
Hey, Eric, real quick though, I think that's very relevant. Just a point where we were talking before, like why conspiracy theories, or like why do these arise? Not only the mindset that lends itself, but I think unfortunately in the modern context, all it takes for someone to understand that things aren't necessarily always the way they appear is to have one thing turn out to be untrue that they previously thought to be true, that usually comes from an establishment, a place of authority and trust, which means in their mind it opens up, it's like Pandora's box. Like, I'm joking, like Eric's moment for the cult was saying there's 27 letters, where it's like he's literally been right 99.9% of the time, like 10,000 whatever, like various facts, just like offhand said it, and that conspiracy theorist is like, wait, go episode 182, go back to that second right there. Did you hear what he just said? How do we even know? Exercise science? Do we even know if he has a PhD? Like, let's back up there. I'm like, okay. But I do think it speaks to that erosion of trust. All it needs is one experience, which I think we all will have at some point in our life. Like, it doesn't, whatever institution, like governments, that all governments have propaganda, but it lends itself to then the formation of opening up the possibilities that things are seemingly more complex or not the way that they appear. So,
yep.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. That's funny. I had another moment like that. I was on the boys podcast, 50% Facts,
Yep.
with Jim and Mike.
Yep.
And they were asking me about protein, and we started talking about amino acids. And I can't remember if they prompted it or if I prompted it. I think, no shade, guys, but they asked me, so what are there, 8 essential amino acids? And I was like, yep. Yeah. And we went from there. And so there are actually 9 essential amino acids. And to my to kind of defend myself, one of them used to be, so there are 9. One of them used to be classified as a conditionally essential amino acid, like back when I took my first nutrition course. So, yeah. But I had a comment on my Instagram, or it's on YouTube, I can't remember, but it was like 20 minutes in, there are only 8 essential amino acids, turned it off, this guy's a charlatan. I was like, God damn it.
Yeah.
Like that absolutely does happen. You're not allowed to make any mistakes, or everything you said is always wrong forever. So yeah, that is a thing. But yeah, and honestly, that's like, that crack can get exploited by people that are promoting disinformation.
Yep.
Or is something that your own cognitive biases will exploit just to help you maintain your current worldview, because that's where humans feel safe.
Yep.
So that's why it's so hard to disentangle someone from incorrect beliefs that are strongly held, is because they have a cohesive worldview. They have a simple explanation. Yep. They understand how the world works. And for them to challenge their own beliefs, they lose their worldview. So if there's a crack that their brain can exploit to help them feel safe and like they understand how the world works, it will do it. And it's not even necessarily something they're actively doing and they have to rationalize or convince themselves,
Eric.
So I think that's hard.
Eric, I'm going to go there, bro, is that I'm going all the way and we're going to lose 24%, I'm joking, of our listeners. But I think at the inception of COVID, or 6 months or a year after, not whether or not, like COVID's real, not that argument, but like why, like what caused COVID and whether it was an intentional, like worldwide government, like world leaders and that whole
Globalists.
line of thought. Yeah. It's like there's one or two possibilities. Either the world is inherently more chaotic and fragile than you previously had supposed, and so your life and the lives of everyone else around you can be thrown in complete disarray at a moment's notice from an unintended consequence of a chain of events that you couldn't have predicted. That's a possibility. Or two, there is a clear, intentional, worldwide organization that's orchestrating this thing to happen for ABC. It's like, which of the two? It's like, and as soon as you give up that control, the world actually, like, as much as conspiracy theorists love to talk about whatever, like the global oligarchs, like the Illuminati, like whatever, like alien, like insert whatever, it's far scarier for them to admit that the like chaos, the inability to accurately predict the world, and the randomness of just existence in general. It's scarier for them that than whatever the boogeyman is.
Yeah, and that fear is strong enough that it enables people who hold conspiracy beliefs to hold conflicting conspiracy beliefs, and sometimes, which I think is some of the most fascinating things. Yeah. Like, actually, just to dovetail on what you're saying, this is, I think, really interesting, is that a lot of the people who hold conspiracy thieves about, globalists or basically really strong, pervasive, controlling agents in centralized governments or shadow governments or what have you, they're also the same people who criticize big governments as being inefficient bureaucracies which can't get anything done. So I want like 3 seconds of silence for the listener to think about that. Is it possible that big governments are able to conduct a globalized conspiracy that only certain pockets on 4chan are able to disentangle and tell, while also it being possible that governments are incredibly inefficient and can't get anything done? I'll let you decide.
It's the shadow government, Eric. So there's the puppet government. There's the shadow government. Yeah. And now, what's funny? The three conspiracy theorists that are listening to our podcast, like, he gets it. He gets it. Like this man right here, he gets it.
That's it. I know what your pseudonym is on 4chan now. So anyway, so yeah, it's hard to deal when people are really, really bought in. But I think it's just important to remember that that's not necessarily who you're targeting as a science communicator.
Yep.
You're targeting whoever is open to change. It is not necessarily our job to, try to push people through the stages of change. It's our job to engage with those in the most effective way who are in a position, who want to learn and may change things. Yep. And being a jerk, being incivil, those are things that are going to cause a problem. Getting back to my razors, I had one out. I talked about Occam's. My other hand, though, is Hanlon's. So Hanlon's razor, it's the less known razor, but equally sharp. And it is a great one. It actually started as, I think, just someone wrote into a philosopher's book and it got included as an adage. So it's not like I have empirical basis to show this is true. But I think it is a really important way of dealing with people. And I think it is also backed up by the principle of charity, which, I know that's on Helm's bingo, but it is actually a really good way to handle scientific discourse. But anyway, so Hanlon's razor, I can paraphrase it or I can say it the more jerk way. The funny thing is it's this kind of incivil comment, so it doesn't really fit in greatly with what I'm promoting. But the actual quote is, "Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity." Yeah. So the way I normally phrase that is ignorance, because I don't think necessarily it's not like not knowing how carbohydrates are metabolism is not stupidity. Like, who would know that unless they actually have been educated on it, right? And if you haven't been educated on it and someone tells you a way that they're metabolized that isn't accurate, why would you assume they're wrong, right? So anyway, I think it is. People might dismiss Hanlon's razor because it's an uncivil comment to give some meta discussion of this comment, but it's a really useful one, right? And to those who would think they have the license to go to war against someone who's promoting disinformation, I think it is really important that they realize that sometimes when they think they're engaging with disinformation, it is misinformation. And what's very predictable? That telling someone that they're intentionally harming people and when they're actually trying to help them won't get a good response. Like, that won't go well. It's very predictable, Like if someone actively thinks that low carb diets are going to solve the obesity epidemic and it's the most important thing we can do to improve public health, and you tell them that they're a whack job conspiracy theorist who's trying to sell something and hurt people, and how dare you, you're killing people with heart attacks, they're not going to go, oh, that's a good point, I should really not do that anymore, right? They're just going to block you or get mad or send their followers in an attack pattern, or maybe not even send their followers in an attack pattern. Their followers will just do that because they have the same view, So, yeah, I think Hanlon's razor is really important. And I think that is even more so, though, like even if, like I said this before, if you find someone who is promoting disinformation, there is really no point engaging with them on their battleground. I think, okay, now let's talk about what we should do given all of this, right? We know simplicity tends to be more logical to people. We know civil arguments tend to be more logical to people. We know that reaching people who have really strongly held ideological beliefs, it's going to be a challenge. But what can we do? And I think essentially, when you're approaching someone with disinformation, it's an opportunity to refute the claim, provide the correct information, and spend time ringing the bell at the same time as them. So there's at least two different messages. And then hopefully, because you're providing a clear, simple, logically consistent, referenced, evidence-based message, and you're using the principle of charity, that you will have hopefully a larger impact, or at least an equal impact, or that it'll, you're making some efforts to minimize the damage that disinformation is causing. If you want to go to war with them, sure. Just try not to make us all look bad by being a jerk. I think there's nothing necessarily wrong with public call-outs, right? But I don't think you should expect much to come of it from the person. You're not going to get that truly, like what do we want? Like, what do our souls want when we see someone who's wrong? We want to come up to them, slap them in the face, tell them they're an idiot, and they just get submissive and they go, you're right, I'm sorry, and I will change my ways. But that's not what happens, and that's definitely not going to be what happens with someone who's promoting disinformation. So how do we get as close to that as possible when we're dealing with misinformation? So again, this is someone inadvertently spreading false information, slapping them in the face. I think we've established Hanlon's razor and just the way that would be perceived in the way humans work, not going to go well. Now, here is actually the point where you are dealing with misinformation, someone inadvertently spreading incorrect information, where I do think it's actually worth engaging with them. And this is the ironic thing. People, because they have a sense of justice and righteousness, they want to go after and go to war with the disinformation rather than the misinformation. But I think the time that it actually makes sense to engage with people is with misinformation. And that's because their intentions are pure. They're actually trying to help people. You guys are on the same page. You're trying to help people. They're trying to help people. They got something wrong, and you have correct information. So you could potentially be useful to them. So now you have two options, like that meme of the sweaty guy about to push the button,
Yep.
And it's privately message them with a nice, comment, acknowledge your similarities, and have a discussion, and maybe see if they're open to correcting information they put forth, or publicly call them out on your profile and also tag them in the comments. Hit the button, right? Don't do that. Because I can tell you one thing, that even when someone does share the same intentions with you, even when they are trying to help people, publicly calling them out is going to be less effective than privately calling them out, because no one likes to be embarrassed publicly. No one likes to be called out as the guy who got it wrong in front of their whole audience. It's going to put social pressure on them to double down or to ignore you or to block you. And guess what? What is going to have a larger impact? The person themselves correcting their information or making a more nuanced post later, whatever allows them to save some face but actually put the correct information out later, or you dunking on them publicly. Like, even if they don't block you or do accept what you're saying, a bunch of the followers are going to perceive you as a jerk, And even if you do it nice, even if you are respectful and you do call them out, calling out the person rather than the claim, you don't get to just assume that it's going to be taken that way. You can do everything in your power to do it in a respectful way, but essentially you are publicly saying someone else is wrong. And that can be perceived as an attack, even if it's not. And it may actually have the effects of an attack, right? So even you do everything as right as possible, it could harm their reputation. It could harm their business. It could harm their livelihood, or it could make them fear those things happening, It's just because like that's the way people operate. Like I'm going to follow someone because I think they're right more often than they're wrong. Oh, that's a wrong tick box, you know. And I'm by no means am I suggesting that it's okay to try to always appear right in public and to promote your own ego. But I'm saying that that's a part of all humans. So when and even if the person doesn't perceive it as an attack, there's no surety that their followers won't perceive it as an attack. So my advice to you, anytime you're dealing with misinformation, is the first step should be to try to privately and respectfully contact the person and see if they're willing to engage you about something. Not just call them out privately and be a jerk to them, but say, hey, I noticed in that recent post about nutrition or training or whatever that you said, X, Y, and Z. I have a couple of thoughts about it. Would you be open to discussing it? First ask for permission instead of just blasting them with a wall of text. And, a lot of times they'll never get back to you, and that's okay. But if they do get back to you, then you can have a discussion about so here's some research. I don't know if you're aware of it, and it might be a little closer to X, Y, and Z. And then again, they might disagree. They might not want to go down that rabbit hole. They might not have time, and that's okay. They don't have any obligation to do so. And getting self-righteous, getting into a fight with them, it's not going to help your cause, right? But you'd be surprised, and I have done this many times, how more often than not, if you can actually get the read receipt, and they engage with you, they'll get to a point where they go, oh shit, like I learned something, because they don't have it's not a rap battle with a circle of people around them just waiting to go, oh, like it is on social media. It's a private discussion with two people who, if you did it right, are connecting on shared values, right? We're both trying to help people, and I want to help you help people. And then just think about what's going to have the bigger impact. They make a post the next day, or they get on their stories and they say, hey, I came across some new data, and one thing I want to clear up, blah, 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 in whatever way feels most comfortable for them. And it's coming, like their followers hear it from their leader, or the, Captain actually in the comments that might not even be seen by most people, raising the intellectual point, so it's going to be far more impactful if they do it rather than you. And the way you can get that done is by actually approaching them with a little bit of humanity and respect. Now, with that said, a lot of the time, if you're dealing with someone who has, 500,000 followers, you've got a couple hundred, you primarily are, you're the potentially jaded personal trainers trying to deal with this all. You want to just call them out or make memes or try to get a big enough following, or you go to someone else to ask them to call them out. So I understand that sometimes it can feel very difficult to even approach these people. So I think it is okay when you don't even register on their radar to make posts where you do reference the post specifically, you reference the person, but you do so in a respectful manner. And you try to address it. Sure, you'll be limited by your reach, but if you can't reach out to them, it's okay. If they don't even see your read receipt, if you're not on their radar, it's probably not going to create a conflict anyway. It probably won't be perceived as a battle, but it is totally fine in those cases to actively make a post about it. I will say, though, that you have the least amount of likelihood of turning off people who follow that person or who are, sipping the Kool-Aid and that's their cult if you deal with the claim primarily and not the person. So that's a general piece of advice I would have is refute claims. Don't refute people. Don't make assumptions or claims about what people's intentions are or their morality or their intelligence levels, because it doesn't really go anywhere. But actually addressing the data, I think, is an important thing, and connecting with people on their mutual goals for health and fitness or education. I think that is really important because, we're all ignorant until we're not. So I think that's an important position to always remind yourself of.
Eric, very well said. I mean, I think as one small example, always going after the claims and not the individuals. We had, Ben Escrow on talking about testosterone recently. So some of the claims of supplement companies, not calling out a specific supplement company, but more the problem with testosterone itself. And then later on, even if it does test out, so if you have the correct amount, what could be some of the potential problems? It's interesting to me because when we made the feedback, of course, we have our own a little group. But I took a look on our YouTube channel as an example for Iron Culture. I would assume on like Apple Podcasts and what do you call it, Spotify. I would say like probably 80% of listeners or whatnot are likely our subscribers. On YouTube, once again, just because of the algorithm, it pumps it out to more people. So you will see on occasion, like I forget the episodes that we've had. I'm trying to remember a specific example. Not anything controversial, but let's say there might be some people that have some very siloed beliefs. So maybe like one on like carbohydrates or whatever. And so you'll occasionally get like, man, this guy calls himself a doctor or whatever. And it's like, this person, cool, right? But in that one, because I would say turkesterone is kind of polarizing only in the sense that some seemingly well-respected figures have been promoting it in certain spaces, have been promoting it for a long time, and so almost an attack on turkesterone or the validity of utilizing turkesterone is an indirect, therefore, attack on their favorite content creator. And so as a result, when your back's up against the wall, you start throwing those 1-2s, and I think in that using that as a context for an example of addressing a claim, I'm perfectly fine with. I think the thing that you're talking about too that's underrepresented, and I wanted you just to discuss it a little bit, Eric, would be when you spoke about taking like a more emotionally intelligent approach, a kind of in the trenches. So not that anyone's coming from the ivory tower, but like you're in the trenches with the person, trying to see eye to eye and have a conversation rather than, once again, a unilateral engagement of I'm right, you're wrong. What else would you add to that? Because I think that's a skill, to your point. I think it's a skill set. You have to overcome our innate desire to like we know what the answer is. So like we're trying to arrive at point X, but you have to back up and show all the steps to get to that process. Any other things you would want to comment on taking, let's say, a more emotionally mature response that would probably allow others to engage with you and then reach, common ground?
Yeah, you frame that really well. I think I think for people who heard what I said and they buy into it and they go, okay, I'm going to try engaging with people in this way. A really important thing is that you don't approach it thinking that you have the moral high ground, but you're just being nice. You actually have to have a conversation with someone and be open to the fact that they won't go somewhere, and not basically like you can't assume that they want to play baseball with you if they're playing soccer.
Yeah.
Right. So if you walk up and go, hey, would you like to play a game? Cool. All right. So we both have agreed that baseball is the best game. So here's a bat. And they go, no, I want to play soccer. And you go, you're not like, what are you doing? No, we're playing baseball. Like, I think that is the way a lot of people don't quite get this right. Like they're moving towards something a little bit better instead of just like talking shit and calling them out. They are going, I noticed that you posted this. I appreciate you trying to help people. By the way, you're wrong. Would you like me to tell you how you're right? And they go, no, I'm not interested. And they go, well, that's bullshit. You should be open to like, and then it just goes right back to calling them out. Right. Yeah. So I think it's similar. And we've talked about this before. Like when someone is not necessarily bought into the same worldview of empiricism and science and understanding truth, like you think you dunked on them with a meta-analysis and they're completely unmoved by it because a meta-analysis doesn't mean the same thing to them that it means to you. Like, you can't start at a point where you're assuming that you're both on the same page with how you assess truth, right? They may overvalue, they may value an anecdote from someone at a high level in a sport more than a meta-analysis that seems to directly contradict that anecdote. Yep. And there's no moving them, right? And at that point, you can't just like throw your hands up and call them an idiot. So I think what you have to do when you're approaching people like this is you have to legitimately approach them to see what they're open to discussing, right? So when you reach out to them, it needs to be like, hey, I saw you recently made this post. We're on the same page with trying to help people get to, because you probably want the same outcome, like heart health or fitness or whatever. And I've been reading about this recently, and it's something I've actually studied, or whatever is your situation for the listener. And I wanted just to talk to you about it a little more because I see it a little differently than you. And I wonder if some of what I've learned could help your audience. And they may stop engaging with you right there, or they may be open to continuing. And I think you have to be willing to potentially accept that their worldview of how they come to truth is not the same as yours. And you have to think about, okay, well, what direction do I go here? Do I need to actually explain to them how science works here, but not in a condescending way, Or is this a case where I go, okay, no, I totally understand where you're coming from. I get it, where, you see like people who have reached this level as blah, 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 like you might have to talk about the weaknesses of anecdotes. And this whole time, you're really trying to come from the perspective of not, my end game is getting this person to do the right thing. And I'm frustrated that I have to do it. I'm annoyed with them, but I'm being nice because I know if I'm not nice, it won't work. You have to let go of that. You actually have to believe when you're talking to them that you have a respect for them, that they have genuinely good intentions, and that and to see what they are open to and to help them get as close to moving towards maybe correct information as possible. And if you generally don't think they're a good person and they won't do that, then don't message them, right? But there's probably something between the good intention misinformation provider and the disinformation provider. It's the person who is, arrogant, thinks they're always right, and doesn't care to hear anyone else who wants to challenge them, but they're not actively trying to promote disinformation. There's a lot of people like that. And, you're going to have to assess this on a case-by-case basis as to whether it is worth your time and effort and what's the probability of moving forward. But I think a lot of people are very kind of, facts over feelings. I like science space. I wish people were like math. They're unwilling to put in the effort, the time, and the thought, or maybe incapable to have these emotionally intelligent discussions and to read the person and to try to say things in a way that will be perceived. And they feel like it's an imposition on themselves. Like, I should be able to present you facts and you would change your mind. But honestly, I think when someone kind of throws up their hands like that and they're just like, people are just listening to their emotions, and it's like an intellectual weakness. You're throwing up your hands and saying you basically don't know how to talk to people, and that's okay. But you need to get better at it if you want to be in this space. Like if you want to be a science communicator, it's not science; it's science communication. When communication happens with people, so if you're just someone wholly unwilling to work on your communication skills and you think just throwing facts at people and letting them know when they're wrong is all that is required, and if the person doesn't change their mind, then it's on them, and that and all of a sudden now it becomes disinformation. Like, I did my job. You put your misinformation out. I gave you a meta-analysis. You didn't agree with me. Now I put you in the classification of disinformation and you're dead to me, and I will dunk on you. You didn't do it. You just are super, super intellectually lazy when it comes to emotional intelligence, or you're incapable, and that's okay. But just maybe this isn't for you. Don't go into the battle. Just promote good information. Refute the claims, post about the meta-analysis, help people understand it. If that ain't your bag, fine. But don't go in there and turn off people to the whole idea of science because you're an asshole.
Whew, Eric, that's a mic drop moment. Allow me to speak in another way for those that might be on the fence. I want to use an analogy from a totally other not toxic space, which is the pickup game space, pickup community. It's a numbers game, folks. So I'm going to speak to them. It's a numbers game. We know if you don't get the number, it's their fault that they don't see what you have to offer. You just got to keep going down the list. So, if they don't listen to what you have to say, the fault isn't within you and your approach to things. It's totally on them. And just keep your head up, young king, because you'll get the bag eventually.
Yeah, I don't even know if I can ironically continue with you down on that path because of how terrible pickup artists are. But no, absolutely, yep. that is the underlying tacit implication and philosophy behind it, right?
Eric, real quick, I just want to echo, man, what you said. Only in the sense that I think one of the basic qualities of being a human is more reciprocity, so you treat others how you want them to treat you. And if you're not entering a conversation in a civil, respectful manner, and they could sense it, even if it's it's the wording you use, if it's like a conversation in person, that I think sometimes, let's say someone who is a science communicator, they know they're right in their mind, so they're entering the conversation with a loaded gun. So it's almost like you're entering a conversation. It's like you put the gun on the table, and you're like, let's just have a conversation, guys. And you're like, whoa.
Let's see if we can get to the same page.
You're like, whoa, wait a second. And it's interesting because I would say from a time allocation standpoint to what you just said, Eric, about that's okay if it's not going to work out. I think you have to accept strong possibility, and this we have all a finite amount of time, that not every interaction will leave you with the desired outcome, and that is perfectly okay. And that's where time management, like on your part, on all of our parts, where it's like, where do you choose to spend your time? And then you assess over time, like, what does that look like? Where do you want to be?
No, and I think to is my final point that I want to piggyback on top of that is that there will be many times where this doesn't work, but don't underestimate the value of planting a seed.
Yeah.
Because people have to be exposed to things multiple times. Their ego might be large enough that they were not going to admit anything to you in that conversation. But they will but if you can at least leave the conversation in such a way that you didn't burn the bridge, they will remember it.
Yep.
And if they're exposed to similar information later, you didn't give them the easy out of going, this guy's just a jerk who's full of shit, But that's on you if they did leave that, not completely on you, but it could be on you for you to have the opportunity to plant a seed, and for you to eventually be like, they're not letting me, like they won't become a tree right now. I'm gonna throw this seed in your face, That's not what you do. So the goal should be, in the worst case scenario, if they will actually respond to your message, for you to have presented them the information in a respectful way, you were respectful, and for you to have left the conversation without it have elevated to conflict or personal attacks or anything like that. For them to respectfully, I think it's actually, you'll be pissed, but them leaving the conversation respectfully disagreeing with you when you've presented good, solid, logical, factual information, but they're, for whatever reason, ego, time, just unwillingness to see it your way, or that they just don't see it your way, that is okay. Because what you did do was you provided them the information and you didn't burn the bridge, and you don't know what's going to happen next month, 3 years later, 5 years later. And I have absolutely, now that I've been around in this space for more than a decade, seen people come around.
Yep.
And we've been able to talk about something in retrospect.
Yep.
And I've seen, some content producers to get worse over time.
Yep.
When they use their ego to protect them. Some get better. Like, for example, I've been increasingly impressed with precision nutrition over time. And, we had John Berardi in the podcast way back in the early days. There was a time when his content, I disagreed with more of it than less of it. And now because they put mechanisms in place to be more collaborative, to check their things and be more, have more of a science-based team, they progressively got better over time. And that's not the only example. It's just a big one that I think is relevant. So be open to the fact that another example, actually, and not that this person was ever not science-based, I want to be clear, but Greg did a great job, Greg Knuckles, recently being on the Table Talk podcast with Dave Tate.
Oh.
And I think,
I didn't see that.
I really
That's
like,
awesome.
It's quite good. Yeah. No, I like Dave Tate, and I like Elite FTS, and Dave is someone who I tremendously respect because he is always keeping himself up to date. He won't let himself get mired in any beliefs of the past. And he asks himself, how could I be wrong? I think that's built into him to some degree. And while I think some people in the evidence-based space might look at him and be like, oh, he's super, super West Side and there's only one way to do it, I don't think that's how he operates. That was the conjugate method of periodization was something that's a lens that he sees a lot of things through, but that doesn't mean that it's can't be empirical, or that there weren't things and elements of that echo a lot of other things that are seen as quote unquote science based, like motor learning or undulating periodization or things like that. I think it's the ultra specificity boys are probably a little out of step with some of our motor learning concepts if taken too far. So anyway, it was just a great conversation. They talked for a couple hours, and what was very obvious to me was how open and interested in science Dave was, despite the fact that he is viewed as kind of like an in the trenches first, type of guy. So I think a lot of these tribal groups that we think are separate and have different worldviews are not quite as separate as we believe. And when we approach each other like we're on different planets, it creates that reality more often than it is actually true in the first place.
Eric, well said, man. So I'm gonna check that out because Dave's an OG and then hearing about Greg being on, which is actually, that's interesting because I think Greg, one, he'd immediately earned the respect superficially because my man's super strong. So you enter the poker game with like a decent amount of chips, and then also Greg is one of those dudes to put some respect on Knuckles' name, willing to engage with people. And I think like even if I've witnessed scenarios where Greg is clearly right, but he's asking questions to the other person and engaging with them until like the aha moment happens. I'm not saying that's what happened at all with Tate.
Can I put a little more respect on Dave's name?
Yeah.
He was one of the first subscribers to Mass once it came out.
Bro, I like the they're not to your point. I wouldn't describe them as separate worlds. I would just say they're different communities. That's all. But I like seeing them interact. That's super cool, man.
Yeah, and then the reason I wanted to speak to it is not because they're separate worlds, but because people perceive them as separate worlds. They kind of think that some people in the evidence-based community, I think, unfairly pigeonhole Dave Tate or the elite FTS community as maybe not being as science-based as I think they actually are.
Yeah.
Because we don't have the science that says that a certain periodization form is accurate. So I do think to some degree there has been way too broad of brushes you've been used in the discussion of like West Side and some other things. So or like multiply enhanced lifters or things like that. And I just don't think it's true. I think they've always been a large segment of them very, very informed and interested in science. But like you said, they are different communities. And so there's assumptions made about it. But yeah, all four of us were like, what? Dave Tate subscribe? That's awesome. We all had a little bit of fanboying in our private message group when that happened. And so no, it's just, I think Dave Tate is a great example of an open-minded thinker who changes his mind. And it doesn't matter that he has seen like incredible success with athletes. Like he hasn't, like that's another example, kind of like precision nutrition, of a lot of people become more closed as the anecdotes they believe seem to produce more success, even though they might just be being more siloed. Like Dave is always, as Mike T put it on a recent podcast, trying to figure out how to build the better mousetrap.
Yep.
He's always open to there possibly being a better way where other people would let their ego satisfy them and be like, no, we've got a solution and it seems to work for everyone who comes through our doors. And I don't want to look at people who don't come through our doors or whatever, or I'll blame the people who don't succeed on their own personal failings. That's not Dave Tate. And I think that it's really well represented in that discussion with Greg. So shout out to that podcast. Shout out to Greg. Big shout out to Dave Tate, who's been doing helpful things for the community and the lead FTS for years. And he just displayed such intellectual humility, curiosity, and willingness to engage in that podcast that I think it's a great example just to show how much you can impact people when you do it in this kind of true, genuinely open way, rather than yelling at people for not getting something right on Thursday.
God. Yeah, and let this just be a lesson for everyone once again, to maybe come full circle, that brought up this whole idea that we were incorrect about releasing a podcast on Monday, that with your self-righteousness, after we explained to you from the peak of the pyramid why you were wrong, don't come at the Kangs if you plan on missing, because if you come at us, you better not miss. And that is why you need humility in your life, of what Eric is alluding to. So thank you. No, that was brilliant, my friend.
I couldn't have said it any better.
No, but Eric, actually too, because like I like this, man. We're back. We're doing a lengthy. This is a deep one for the true cult. Let us circle back. Do you want to say anything in closing? I think I love the path. Like you took everyone honestly on the journey. You spoke about everything, the key considerations, personal standpoint, your evolution, different examples, anything to come back to. I think you really like wrap this one up nicely, but.
Yeah, I guess just a closing statement on how to produce content in general, whether it is, countering misinformation or disinformation or just information for information's sake, is that being civil really does make a difference. And using the principle of charity, where you take the most charitable interpretation and the most logical interpretation of someone else's argument, is very, very important, where you give someone as much of the benefit of the doubt as is possible. And then you get into what you have to say, and you do so in a respectful manner. You refute the claims, not the person. And then importantly, you think about the way that humans evaluate information, in addition to things being less seemingly logical. If you're a jerk about it, simplicity sells. And the trick there is that a lot of the misinformation is people oversimplifying things. So you want to be a part of the solution, not the problem, when understanding that. So there's one quote that is attributed to Einstein and one that is misattributed to Einstein, and they're both very relevant. The first one is that everything should be explained as simply as possible, but no simpler. And the second quote is that if you can't explain something simply, you don't know it well enough. The second one is actually not attributed to Einstein. The first one is a paraphrase of what he said. And I think they're both pretty valuable quotes to understand. Like, everything should be explained as simply as possible, but no simpler. That's a relatively low bar to clear when you're explaining nutrition and training, right? Focus on the applied. Focus on the what you actually do. Don't get into the weeds with mechanisms unless you have to, because the person did that you're potentially trying to refute to some degree, or the claim requires you to do it. So, but really make extreme efforts to not get it wrong, because then you can become the misinformation of tomorrow. So yeah, be as simple as possible, but get it right. And that is sometimes that means that you can't get it under a 10-minute video. Like, you can ask Omar. When I was in the pre-Iron Culture days, when he'd ask me to talk on topics, he'd be like, "Yo, man, can you keep this under 7 minutes?" And I come back to him like, "I got it down to 10." And he's like, "All right." And I know that's probably the best it could have been done. Yeah. Well, at least for me. Obviously, I can improve, and there are some people who are better at this. Shout out Jeff Nippard to being simple without getting it wrong, and really building a whole massive YouTube channel on that. But I think, if that is your goal, you're only going to be getting better at that process over time. But just remember, simple as possible, but not wrong. Yeah. So, yeah.
Look, we all know it's cows in, cows out, and progressive overload. That's kind of like, that's your 1, 2. Here's your left hand, here's your right hand, and away you go.
All problems in society solved.
The whack-a-mole, Eric, but now we're just looking at knocking people out. Calories in, calories out, progressive overload.
Love it.
No. So I will say thank you for being on another episode of Iron Culture. We're approaching the 200 mark, and it's weird because like November, something, episode 200, something. It kind of seems like everything's building towards a peak. It seems like we like peaks around here, like a pyramid, the symbolism of that. We don't have to get into it. It's merely, it's understood. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's the main theory. I want to thank everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. For those participating, once again, either in our community or right here amongst the cult, you could go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does help us out. People typically, like even that person that called us hypocrites, gave it 5 stars. Really appreciate it, Chem Kid. And we'll catch you every single Monday from now until the end of time.